Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for From History to Action, Presidential Libraries and the Future of Civic Engagement. My name is Caitlin Yeager. I'm a program director for Missouri Humanities, which is a member-supported organization dedicated to enriching lives and strengthening communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. At their core, the humanities explore how we understand and connect with the human experience through both our shared and individual histories, cultures, and traditions. A quote from the National Archives Presidential Libraries page says this, which links our conversation directly to the humanities. Presidential libraries hold the raw materials of history, evidence of democracy at work, and of the continuing relevance of the president's past decisions. As part of Missouri Humanities 2025 signature series, Missouri Voices, Civics, and Citizenry, we feel this program serves as a fitting kickoff for our virtual keynote. Throughout this year, we're considering individual and collective roles in civic engagement and democratic participation as we examine the bold American experiment of a government run by and for the people, rooted in the U.S. Constitution. Through programs and digital content, we'll explore the complex history of American democracy and Missouri's enduring participation. And of course, as with every webinar, here are a few housekeeping items before we jump in. We, of course, encourage you to participate in the conversation. Today, we are going to be using the chat feature for comments and any sort of commentary that might not need to be addressed, but if you have an actual question you would like to submit, please use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many comment or questions as possible during the discussion, and a note to please keep comments and questions respectful to maintain a welcoming and thoughtful space. Closed captionings are enabled in this webinar. All you have to do is go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click Show Captions at the bottom of your screen. After the program, a survey link will appear. We greatly appreciate your feedback as it helps us shape future programs. So if you would fill out that survey, just take a few moments after the program, we'd really appreciate it. And of course, to learn more about Missouri Humanities, follow us on social media at MoHumanities or visit mohumanities.org. You'll find details on upcoming events and our membership program, which includes free books, discounted tickets, and VIP access to events. So with that, I am thrilled to introduce our panelists and moderator, which represents 4 different presidential libraries here in the United States. On our panel tonight is Dr. Jay Barth, Executive Director of the William J. Clinton Presidential Library and Museum in Little Rock, Arkansas. Alex Burden, Executive Director of the Truman Library Institute in Kansas City, Missouri, which is the nonprofit arm of the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Christina Schutt, Executive Director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And leading our conversation is Dr. Lindsay Travinsky, Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Thank you so much to all of you for agreeing to be part of this program. And with that, I will have Lindsay take it away.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's a thrill for us to be able to talk about these subjects. And I think I can speak for everyone by saying that, at least I am very passionate about this work. But if there weren't people who wanted to hear about it and people who didn't want to learn about history, then I couldn't get to do it as a job. So we are very grateful that there are those of you out here who want to learn more. I do also want to echo the plea to please put your questions in the Q&A. We want to be able to address the subjects that are important to you and give you the information that you want to know. And so we can't do that unless you tell us what that is. So I think we should probably start with a couple of basic questions to set the foundation for what we're talking about. And I think, especially given that we have a wide variety of chronologies in terms of our presidents, this question is particularly important because the answer is not going to be the same for everybody. What are presidential libraries and what do they do? So I'm just going to kick off with mine by saying that the George Washington Presidential Library is under the umbrella of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. It is private, it is nonprofit. We don't take any state or federal funding, which means we are not a part of the National Records, National archives and records system, which is going to be a little bit different from some of the answers you hear. We primarily are focused on the study and history and teaching of Washington, his world, and his legacy. And that is through public programming, research programs, and scholars, teaching education facilities for teachers and students alike, as well as a leadership institute. So that is my library. Why don't we go for this one? I'm not going to call on every person because, as I said in the green room, everyone here is adults and we will act like it. But for this purpose, let's go chronologically, and I'll hand it over to Christina.
Well, hello. It's great to be with you all tonight. So our mission at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum is to inspire civic engagement through the diverse lens of Illinois history and sharing with the world the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We are unique in that we are the only state operated presidential library. We're not, while we do receive some federal funding for some of the projects that we do, we're primarily operated through state general revenue as well as through private donations from folks. We've actually existed since 1898 as the Illinois State Historical Library, but about 20 years ago, really kind of stepped forward in the acknowledgement that actually we're the largest collection of Lincoln material. And so we do Lincoln, but we also really situate him within Illinois history and within the broader kind of regional history that's happening in this area.
Alex, think you're up.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Missouri Humanities for this opportunity to be with their audience tonight. I appreciate it very much, and thank Caitlin for this organizing this event and offering this really wonderful signature series, Missouri Voices, which I'm sure will be a huge hit throughout the year. And also, Lindsay, thank you for moderating this event, and also thank you in advance for coming to the Truman Library later this year to participate in our summer teacher conference in July. We look forward to having you on site, and we've got a really nice couple of events planned for you. The Truman, I'm going to talk kind of collectively. The Truman Presidential Library and Museum is a National Archives and Records Administration facility. The Truman Library Institute is the nonprofit partner of the Presidential Library. We work very closely together. Both organizations were dedicated and founded in 1957. Both organizations were supported by President Truman, his friends, and his specific mission for what we do. And what we do is we're both a repository for the Truman Collection, which is 16 million documents from his administration and life, 33,000 artifacts, oral histories, video clips, audio clips, you name it, we have it. And we share those resources and materials as widely as possible. The National Archives focuses more on the research work and education, whereas the Truman Library Institute supports both of those, but we're also involved with the communications, the marketing, the public programming. So combined, we try to reach as many people as possible with lessons about the presidency and history and Truman's specific mission that we be a cultural and educational institution.
So like Alex's library, the Clinton Presidential Library is part of the National Archive system. We are one of the, it's now 16 presidential libraries. We live at the Clinton Presidential Center, which encompasses not just the Presidential Library, but also the Clinton Foundation, which is akin to Alex's institution. And then we also have a master's only institution, the Clinton School of Public Service, on our grounds as well. We are a little bit different from the Truman Library in that we are one of the libraries that comes after 1978, and therefore we are subject to the Presidential Records Act. And so rather than a president giving his papers to a library, instead the papers, of course, are the papers of the people, and they are collected and brought into the Presidential Library. We're a really large presidential library collection because we are both a paper library as well as an electronic library. We were really the first library to have emails, and so we have about 78 million pages of official records, about 20 million emails. We have 2.6 million photographs, 12,000 or so videotapes. And then we've also got about 100,000 artifacts. We're a really large collection, and that creates great opportunities, but also great challenges as we begin to work through, as we continue to work through conserving those, preserving those, and making them accessible to people in person and digitally.
Jay, thank you so much for that distinction. And I think it's worth noting just for some history for people. So prior to the Presidential Records Administration, it was largely up to the president what they did with their records. And FDR was the first who actually decided to create a presidential library. Some of the ones like Hoover were then backfilled. But for some of the earlier presidents, including Washington, they retained possession of all of their documents. And if they were particularly good record keepers, then we have a very robust written record. If they weren't, like, for example, Zachary Taylor, we do not have a particularly good record. And so that discrepancy, I think, is worth noting, especially as we get into the conversation and talk a little bit more about how presidential libraries and centers might do things a little bit differently. So our second sort of table setting question, which I think is important, is how do you all define civics? Small question.
I'll pop in to give it a first shot. And I think it's I see it as having three components. First, it's of course about its civic knowledge. Is the basic knowledge about how our system of governance works at its different levels. I think second, it is civic engagement, and that is figuring out how an individual's skills and talents mesh with the ways in which they can make a difference using those systems. And then finally, the third is really civic dispositions, and that is how one does this work in a civil way, in a way that is that brings certain personality traits into that environment, because civics is ultimately a human institution, right? And so the human skills and the ways of interacting with others in a not just polite way, but in a way that really is respectful in a fundamental way is really important. So I think those are the three components. We at the Clinton Presidential Library, we really put our focus on the civic knowledge. That's where we can really bring not just insights about the 1990s and the Clinton presidency to the table with our records, but we can also, of course, using our linkages to the rest of the National Archives, really bring all of those records going back to the beginning of American government to light for folks of all ages.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, and I think from the Truman standpoint, back in when Truman founded the library and the institute, I don't think the word civics really existed. He had different words, which I think kind of mean the same thing. Fast forward to when I was a student, I think there wasn't civics; it was social studies, but it was teaching about the government, and our priority is to teach young people, to expose them to American history, to how the government works. We do that through a variety of means, educational programming. But, and I think that's also one of the most pressing concerns in our country right now. And I assume I'm probably jumping ahead, Lindsay, on you here and talking about something you've got a question about later is, the state of civics, whether we call it learning about government or social studies or civics.
From rank and file citizens, from famous people, from kids. I mean, some people who are praising the president, some people who are critical of the president. And that's what's a really interesting thing about the presidency is that it's a two-way conversation. And we really see that a lot through some of the correspondence that shows itself in all our libraries and is really the bulk of a lot of our records.
Well, as the person who is probably America's favorite president, right? It's interesting to
Depends
me.
on which C-SPAN poll we're looking at.
I know, right?
Year.
But he's usually at least in the top.
We trade,
right?
We trade.
So what's funny about that, right, is this idea that every president up to Lincoln, they all want to be seen as Washington, right? The idea of Lincoln growing a beard is sort of radical and they made him do it because he looked sort of gaunt, right? And he also got that cute letter from the girl in, Westfield, New York, right, who encouraged him to grow some whiskers. But everybody wants to be compared to Washington, right? And then you have this time after Lincoln where everybody wants to be compared to Lincoln, right? And they all grow beards because they want to be seen like Lincoln. But I think it also, as much as, we think about Lincoln being beloved now, I mean, the guy's only elected with 39% of the vote, right? He doesn't even appear on ballots in southern states like Arkansas, right? And so this interesting connection between like what does it mean for presidents to connect with citizens, how Lincoln's trying in his first inaugural address to do that, right? We're not enemies, but friends, right? He's trying to convince people like, don't try and overthrow the US government. That's a bad idea, right? Because he's trying to make this connection. But, to Jay's point about these kind of letters, some of the things I'm most struck by are that Lincoln's writing letters asking for, like, mothers are showing up at his gates at the White House because the White House was very different than in Lincoln's time than it is today. There was not like Secret Service. They had a door guard, but it was mostly to open the door, right? And there would be these long lines of people coming in to petition Lincoln. And so these mothers, as their sons are being arrested, are prisoners of war, they would show up and ask Lincoln to intervene. And Lincoln's writing out these little slips of paper where he's saying, "Hey, let this woman come see her son at a prisoner of war camp," right? And I think that is one of the ways in which they're connecting, right? Eventually, his secretaries, convince him that you can't have people come all the time. Like, you're never going to get any work done as president. And so they have these kind of office hours they institute where people can come in, and they allow them to put up a screen, right? To separate the family from the public in some ways. But yeah, it's this sort of interesting relationship, and especially I think too when presidents after presidents die, and in Lincoln's case in such a very dramatic way, it also changes the way that the public thinks about him. One of my favorite pieces in our collection actually connects to your president, Lindsay, where it's literally George Washington instead of, so it's, the idea is Lincoln is like entering heaven, and it's George Washington at the pearly gates instead of, Peter or Gabriel, like welcoming Abraham Lincoln into heaven. And I think, like, what more American connection can you have than that, right?
That's amazing. Well, I love these stories because for me, they're so helpful to think about different moments, different types of things about different presidents appeal to people in different ways. And, a lot of times we have prized accessibility. And when it comes to Washington, both his contemporaries, and I think over the course of history, intentionally, he was prized for a lack of accessibility. He intentionally crafted this sort of marble-like facade so that people could not get close to him. He asked his wife, Martha, to burn their correspondence after he died, and she did, which is, I think, I'm quite convinced where all the good stuff was: the snark, the grudges, the sense of humor, the love. A couple of letters survive with some great sense of humor in them, so we know that he did have it. It's just that it was mostly hidden. And yet, because of that lack of accessibility, and because he was president before the party system had fully entrenched and he isn't really claimed by a party, he kind of does like hover outside of the regular presidential tradition, and sort of stands for the establishment of a lot of these norms and customs and precedents that we think of as central and the scaffolding of our political system. And that's where I think most Americans can find some attachment, can find some understanding of what it means to have a relationship with the president. It's kind of where it all started. And so I'm now transitioning into my question, which for you all, which is I see his biggest advancement of democratic principles, and this is of course small d democratic principles, as the person who proved that a citizen could hold power, could hold enormous power, and then could give it back, that the presidency would work, that we didn't need to have a military dictator, and that was partly in sort of safekeeping of the office for 8 years, but then also the ability to step away from power in the age of Napoleon when that wasn't done. So that was his main contribution. I will then throw it out to you all. What do you think of as, or what do your libraries talk about as your president's main contribution to democratic principles?
I mean, I would, I'd say three things, and hopefully I can remember what number three is by the time I get done with number one and number two. But the first thing is that, you know, Truman's commitment to public service was started when he was, you know, 33 years old and wanted to sign up for World War I, and he wanted to serve his country. His commitment to the country and to the flag. He was a great American patriot, and a very admirable kind of principal position to take for him. You know, and then second, you know, his career of public service started with World War I service, and then he served as a Jackson County judge twice, and then as a senator, and then selected as vice president. So here's an example of how, again, what I was saying earlier about Truman, his background, how this failed farmer and World War I captain and county judge can somehow find himself be the president of the United States of America, the greatest country in the world, just 20 years after, almost 20 years after his first judgeship, which is great. And then the third thing is, you know, Truman was one of the great presidents in defending democracy around the world, with establishing of his Cold War policies and the strong position he took against the Soviet Union at the early phase of the Cold War, his decision to have America invest in our enemies and support Europe through the Marshall Plan. I mean, that was a great democracy versus communism moment in American history. And, you know, that was incredibly important to the president and his administration to protect and expand democracy at a time when it could very well tumble. So those are, I think, the three best examples of how Truman kind of personified, exemplified, advanced notions of democracy in our country.
For Clinton, there's some, I think, corollaries. You know, it's clearly this authentic connection between the president and the people. I mean, what became known as feeling one's pain in conversations about Clinton. But, you know, I think we see it, you know, the fact I talked about all those artifacts that we have, most of those are gifts from the American people. And that really shows a kind of a connection between the people and the folks who lived in the White House. I mean, it's their you know, love of Socks the cat, you know, these things that really kind of connected the people. My light's going out. This second big thing I would say is really in the foreign policy arena, and obviously while Alex's president was, of course, the first Cold War president, the Clinton presidency, of course, was the post-Cold War presidency, and thinking about the expansion of democratic norms and principles to parts of the world where they had been absent for generations. I think that's really the other really important piece of the Clinton presidency in that regard. I'll add a third, which is really the notion that you know, old tensions could be put away and move from violence towards the development of institutions that could really knit a community or a country back together. And of course, we see in Northern Ireland the sustained peace that exists, an imperfect peace, no doubt, but at least a dramatic move in that direction. So those are some of the things that really that we focus on when we tell the story of the 1990s and the Clinton presidency.
You know, it's interesting, like all of our presidents have been impacted or been part of war, right? Which is fascinating, right? In terms of maybe some of their defining moments. I mean, obviously Lincoln, you know, holding a country together, you know, he gets all these opportunities to compromise. They're literally sending delegations saying, hey, we won't attack if you allow us to extend slavery. And Lincoln, through and through, stays true to his values. He was always the person who was anti-slavery, and that doesn't leave him, right, when he goes into the White House. And so, I mean, obviously he would say today his biggest achievement was the 13th Amendment, right, and pushing, you know, stopping what had been a 200+ year practice. And it wasn't, I think we think about it today as being this sort of one-off, right, of these large scale sort of forced labor camps. and that only a few people had them. But what we don't often realize, right, is that slavery was embedded into the very fabric of the country. Every single thing about the United States was enmeshed in some way with slavery. And Lincoln, in a matter, he hypothesizes and thinks, well, maybe he'll be part of the gradual end of slavery. But actually, in the matter of 4 years, the guy ends slavery. And I think that is remarkable, right? It allows for this new birth of freedom that he alludes to, where we now have 4 million people in the United States that now are no longer enslaved. And of course, that directly leads into the 14th and 15th Amendment, right? Which allows for citizenship. And so I think, of course, like that's huge. But I also think that, it's also important to note things like the Morrill Land Grants Act that Lincoln's a part of, right? That establishes land grant colleges. We think about civics and civic education being taught in colleges and universities across the country, right? This civil discourse that's taught in the methods that people engage in higher education. And Lincoln's directly involved in that, right? He's responsible for those things. He's responsible for things like the Transcontinental Railroad, right, which connect the United States and allow for further establishment, right, and unfortunately some settler colonization out west, but also the opening of the West to white Americans, which again dramatically changes the face of the country and who can vote. And then, of course, he's, sort of in one-off situations is considering the idea, right? He doesn't have a problem with women voting. So even this idea, right, that women might have a say, while not originating with Lincoln, right, coming from women themselves, but so much of it starts during the Civil War, right? So much of it grows out of this anti-slavery sentiment, where women are seeking to have a say in this and are denied this and denied access. And he's a part of that trajectory of thinking about it. But I do think it's interesting that all of our presidents, right, shaped by these kind of wartime moments and wartime policies and things that are happening.
I just want to, before we move on to the next question, I just want to flag in the question and answer and chat portion, there were some questions about what the 16 libraries were. And I wanted to let people know that some of them but prior to FDR have been since folded in. So for example, Hoover and the Garfield Presidential Center or Presidential Library or Museum is part of the MPS umbrella. So I think that's how we were counting. Just wanted to let everyone in the chat know that. So,
Lindsay,
go
do
ahead.
you mind if I wanted to respond to one of the comments that I saw in the chat, if that's okay, because I thought it was very connected to a lot of the conversation that we've had. And Rick pointed out that Truman's foreign policy was a bipartisan foreign policy, which he's absolutely right. It wouldn't have been possible to pass the Marshall Plan without the support of Senator Vandenberg from Michigan. But that's a key part of our healthy democracy is bipartisanship, and it existed, I think, at times off and on, stronger or weaker throughout our country's history. Truman was very bipartisan in the work that he did. He came from the Senate, so he had friends on both sides of the aisle, and I think that really facilitated his success once he became president with some of the things he wanted to do in the late 1940s. I think it's also something that maybe isn't working well right now, and part of the reason that our democracy just doesn't seem to be functioning especially well is that our congressmen and senators and the House and the Senate and the president haven't kind of worked together well over the last several administrations. So, I think that's something that we can emphasize as we teach the students and the researchers that come to the Trim Library, and also the public that we do kind of adult learning programming for, is that that's a fundamental part of a healthy democracy in our country. And I hope it's something that we can get back to at some point relatively quickly.
Well, that's a great transition, because I think one of the, you didn't use this word, but it seems to me that in my studies of all of the presidents we've talked about, they were most successful when they embrace the idea of compromise, that to get anything done, you're never going to get everything you want. And you have to give up some things, but then you can probably find a middle ground where you'll achieve more in the long term. And I think in a lot of ways, compromise has become a little bit of a dirty word in politics today. It's a sign of weakness. And so that is something that I think we can teach about how the process is actually designed to work. So maybe that is a good transition of what can we do as libraries, as centers, to help promote a better understanding of how these things work. How can we use the history to help people with civic understanding and participation? And maybe this is an opportunity where you guys can share some of the things you might have going on, some of the programs, some of the exhibits that emphasize these things as examples that might be good inspiration for others to incorporate into their daily lives or their work.
Yeah, I'll highlight two, which I think are particularly valuable, and one is our teacher professional development work, because I think that many teachers at all grade levels really are seeking high quality professional development opportunities, and the fact that presidential libraries really are spread out across the country. And then when we think the more broadly presidential sites, which might be birthplaces or things like that, they're even more spread. I think that creates a way to really present really high quality professional development for teachers. And I think teachers really are yearning for that, not just the skills, but also the community, so that they can rely upon their peers to really seek out tools to use to connect with their students around these issues. And that's an area where we've really put a lot of focus at the Clinton Presidential Library. We, for example, last summer did a really cool program that connected the Eisenhower Library, the Clinton Library, the Brown versus Board National Historic Site, and the Little Rock Central High National Historic Site on around the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board decision, and had a week-long series where there were virtual and hybrid enterprises, so to use technology well. The second really is to highlight lifelong learning, and I think that is really an area where we're leaning in. We've got amazingly talented professional staff who are not educators, but who have deep knowledge because of their work in the archives and in the curatorial space, and bringing that out to the public, learners of all ages, but especially elder learners who really want to stay alive in this work. And that's an area where we're putting a lot of our attention as well, to really reach some new audiences, people who are not necessarily coming to the Clinton Library, but taking it out to them either virtually or taking it out to their spaces in the community.
So I'll say, with things like lifelong learning, I thank you for saying that, Jay, because I love that. Like, Lincoln was a lifelong learner. When he didn't know something, he picked up a book and taught himself. He literally didn't know how to be president. He didn't know he ran a 1-2-man law office, right? But he learned about it. And I think one of the things that's so remarkable to me, and what we as a presidential library museum really try to carry forward, is that learning centered the kind of methodology, the learning centered way of thinking. Lincoln was someone who when I mentioned before, he was always anti-slavery, but he wasn't necessarily for Black people. And that changed over the course of his life because he learned. And so we're always trying to bring that that way of thinking, not only to our teacher education workshops, but also through our camps like Future Presidents of America that we host in partnership with the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site. And it's really about teaching kids that kind of 13, 14-year-old age about what does it mean to be civically minded and civically engaged. How do we develop in ourselves a self-identification around kind of that learning-centered leadership? That leaders don't have to decide when they're 10 years old a position that they can't change when they're 20 years old as they learn more information, or when they're 30 years old or 40 years old when they have even more information, that part of leadership is growth and knowledge and learning. And that's one of the things that we really stress a lot of. We also really stress, and again, it's part of our kind of values oriented way of thinking about leadership and thinking about who we are as an institution. It's about teaching all history. We're big proponents in our case of teaching all of Illinois history, all of American history, because part of people being able to make informed choices in the present and for the future is about knowing all their history. And so teaching about things like slavery, teaching about things that maybe are not the highlights of the country, are not our best moments. Because when we understand those moments, we understand how we got to our highlights, right? When you understand things like, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation allowing for the enlistment of formerly enslaved men into the Army, then you can get to President Truman desegregating the military, because there's a direct thorough line to African American service in the military. And so being able to teach these kind of things are just hugely important as we move into the future.
Amen, Christina. That was awesome. And I think one thing I wanted to say, kind of from a high level, is that how important I feel the work is that all of our institutions, our presidential sites, whether it's a National Archives facility or George Washington in Mount Vernon, or a state-run, state-owned and funded operation with Lincoln. There aren't a lot of organizations across the country that are focusing some of their attention, their resources, and their staff on teaching civics and teaching these important aspects of history and how the government works. And, from our standpoint at the Truman Library, we have two amazing educators, and they do a fantastic job. They probably reach 25,000 students a year, which seems like a drop in the bucket in the greater metropolitan area across the state of Missouri and Kansas. But if we weren't reaching those 25,000 students with our curriculum and our teaching every year, I mean, they're going to get it from teachers, which is awesome. But, social studies and civics is an important but small part of what teachers are trying to teach their students. So, I think we're delivering an incredibly valuable resource to our communities and to our young people. It's great that we have examples of presidents who realize how important it is to learn our history. Truman went back to the Lincoln administration to learn about how he should operate the Truman Committee when he was a senator and investigating war expenditures, saving the country billions of dollars. How should I do this? Well, something similar happened in the Lincoln time. And then in terms of our focus and attention on teachers, and Jay, it's great to hear that you guys are doing that at Clinton. We also invest a significant amount of time in reaching teachers. There's a huge ripple effect in teaching the teachers and teaching them about Truman and history and civics, because they just go back to the classroom. They see dozens, they have multiple classes. I mean, it's just a wonderful way to reach a lot more people than just focusing exclusively on students. We have professional development opportunities that we offer throughout the year, including one coming up this summer. We have a summer teacher conference where 50 or 60 students come in from all over the country. That's the program that Lindsay's coming in for, thankfully, to participate in mid-July at the Truman Library. So it's an incredibly important resource. It's funded by private support. That support is very important to all of these institutions. So those of you on this call who are board members and donors and supporters, thank you for what you do for us, for Clinton, or whoever the president is that you choose to support.
So I want us to make sure we incorporate some of the audience questions into our last bit of conversation here. And, one of the questions I had wanted to ask you, and this builds off of an audience question, is right now we are in a particularly contentious moment. That's not the only time we've been in a contentious moment in American history, to be sure. It's not the only time we've had intense partisan divide, but it is up there. And so naturally, sometimes public dialogue and big conversations around these ideas, around some big subjects, do come up at public events, at teacher institutes. Kids ask some of the best and difficult questions often. So how do you all think about handling big subjects? How do you think about, talking about not wanting to shut down conversation about weighty issues, helping people learn from history to address them in a particularly polarized, intense time where there's a lot of public focus on history and how it is being maybe used by different figures in the news?
Well, I'll stand by what I said before. We teach all the history, right? I think that's so important. One of the things that I think a lot about is what's lost, right? When we don't teach history, I think about what it was like for me growing up and not seeing history that looked like me, right? I never learned about that history in school, right? I didn't learn about African Americans and their service in the military, right, until I was in college. And so I think about what was lost, right? The opportunities to know that there were other people, that it took a lot of people and a lot of different people and a lot of diverse people to make the country that we have today. And that's important to talk about that, right? It's funny that you say that, Lindsay, because for me, I don't know anything else to do but to bring my whole self into the room, right? And that's not just, all of my sort of experience and knowledge as a museum and library leader, but it's also, the fact that like I'm the proud descendant of enslaved women going back to 1791, right? So I literally don't know how to talk about Lincoln apart from acknowledging the fact that my family, right, was a direct benefit of the 13th Amendment, right? And to talk about what that meant, growing up in Missouri and what it meant as a border state, right? That the Emancipation Proclamation didn't touch. I don't know how to talk about him outside of that. And I think it's important that we do because, again, I think it gives us a more holistic picture of who we are as Americans, right? Lincoln often, right? People often like to quote him talking about better angels. Well, how do we understand what it means to be better angels if we don't understand the full complexity of the American story and what got us to this moment?
I will say for myself, I approach history under a pro-democracy umbrella. And I think that's totally consistent. This is small d democracy, of course. That's totally consistent with Washington's greatest contributions. When I'm talking about our democratic norms and principles, they are things that he individually espoused and wrote about and lived and embodied. And some of his greatest contributions are things like the peaceful transfer of power. And so if me sharing Washington's contributions is offensive to someone, then I kind of view that as their problem and not mine. And I also think that that is probably an approach, at least that history is going to be appealing to at least 80% of Americans. There might be some on the left, and there might be some on the far right that aren't thrilled with it, but I think it will appeal to most people. And as long as we can keep centering on the history and, avoid things like feelings, avoid things like opinions, but centering on the history, people, of course, will take what they want from that. But if you can ground it in fact, if you can ground it in things that people did and things that happened, that is usually a good place to start. That's my approach anyway.
Well, I would say, I mean, obviously, we are an emphatically nonpartisan entity. I think all of our institutions are, and that's very important in terms of having a place where everybody can come and share this information together. I mean, we really lean in on two things. One are the records themselves, the primary documents, the other primary sources that are need to be elevated and celebrated to gain historical knowledge, but it's also leaning in on civic knowledge, as I talked about earlier, which is a deep understanding of how these institutions work, how they've been reshaped across time through constitutional amendments and through other events in our history, but it's really leaning into that, to those two things: the history and in the form of records, and the knowledge that we have about these civic institutions and norms.
And Lindsay, I agree with you. I think history is I don't want to use the word safe because that's not my point and that's not what we're trying to be, but I think it's a a really nice access point to talking about difficult histories in our nation's past. I mean, our country has as many bad stories and unfortunate incidents as it does positive stories and great incidents. And I mean, as Christina was saying about her kind of mission for her role at Lincoln, we've got to teach all this history. And we try to do that at the Truman Library when we address, you know, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan for a while, and he wrote things and said things that he shouldn't have. It makes his kind of transformation to being a civil rights president with the deseg order even more remarkable. His using the bomb to end World War II is a very controversial, horrible moment in world history. We don't hide from that. It's you present the facts and you look at the history. It's a great way to have a conversation with someone that doesn't start from this position of political polarization.
I would also add, you know, I think that one of the benefits of sharing the full history actually is that it encourages us to think in a more positive way. And as you just said, Alex, it was a way to demonstrate growth in an individual, in a flawed individual, because all humans are flawed. And sometimes we tend to think of presidents as these sort of separate entities because they hold so much power and they have so much influence and they're in this incredible office. But, you know, we talk about the same growth in Washington where, you know, he, of course, owned enslaved individuals and at times went to great lengths to try and recapture them when they self-emancipated. And yet he also, over the course of the Revolutionary War, started to change his thinking about this institution and the people that were held in bondage. And therefore, when he died in his will, he emancipated the individuals he had legal control over upon Martha's death, which of course is not as much as he could have done, but was also not nothing. And so that growth is really essential to emphasize, but also the, you know, the bad history, the hard history is also essential because it reminds us that all of these people do have their flaws. And if we can view them as flawed people that still did extraordinary things, that means that we don't have to find perfect people in our generation. We just have to have flawed people who are willing to try and do extraordinary things. And to me, that is a much more actually uplifting history, even if it is also a much more accurate history.
Well,
So there's a,
I was
yeah, go ahead. No,
just say,
Christina,
like,
please.
yeah, I think one of the things that I'm struck by and sort of what everybody shared was like choice. Like, I think that's the thing that's so interesting to me about civic engagement, about people thinking it's like that choice piece, right? All of our presidents made choices, right? And they exercised that choice, right? People made choices in electing them, but there was also choices made by the president. And I think that is especially, you know, Alex, like when y'all talk about that long history, right, and the trajectory of where they are, they made choices, right? Which means that if they chose one thing, that like we could make choices, we could choose something different. It's not inevitable. There's, you know, a lot of people, you know, talk about like what does it mean to be in a time of collapse, right? Well, we could choose something different. We could choose a hopeful future, right? We could choose all sorts of things, and that it's not inevitable. Because I think again, when we're not connected and grounded in that history, we just assume all these things were always inevitable, and they weren't, right?
That choice is so essential to loop back to our conversation too about citizenship and participation. It's such a good reminder that all of this is connected, and history cannot be separated from our understanding of civics. So with that, I will turn it back over to our host for closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you to Lindsay, Jay, Christina, and Alex for a thought-provoking, inspirational, and engaging discussion. I echo people in the chat who, take this as a sign to get out there and visit these institutions. They are truly a pillar of American history. It is history alive, and it is if you've never been to a presidential library, walking the exhibits, walking the halls, it gives you goosebumps because you just feel the history and the connection there. So I highly recommend anyone who's able to get out and explore as many as possible. And we're lucky here in Missouri to have several within, a few hours, even a weekend getaway. You can visit, quite a few really great institutions within a radius of Missouri. Thank you to all of you for joining our discussion, for submitting questions, and for being engaged and wanting to also, like our presidents that are represented here today, be lifelong learners. A reminder to please take a few moments to fill out our survey that will pop up on your screen once the webinar ends. So you don't have to go any place different. It'll pop up right there for you to take. We'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's events. This is the first big official event of our signature series. So this will really help us inform the rest of the year that we'll be celebrating and talking about civics and citizenry in preparation of 2026, which is another big year, the 250th anniversary, which will also be a big year for, I'm sure, all of our presidential libraries too. We encourage you to stay in touch with Missouri Humanities by following us on social media at Mo Humanities. You can become a member or join our email list on our website, mohumanities.org. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this conversation and that you feel inspired to stay engaged and connected to your communities and your neighbors and your stories. So until next time, thank you all again very much. We appreciate your time and again, your willingness to learn. So thank you, everybody, and good night.